Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take that stack of source material you've gathered, all the articles, notes, research, and we really plunge right in. Our goal, simple. We want to pull out the absolute core insights, the surprising bits, the stuff you actually need to know, and just serve it up for you. And today, wow, we're tackling something pretty provocative. Our deep dive is grounded in these excerpts from a really fascinating book. It was originally in Arabic, and the title translates to something like The Art of Not Giving a Feck for Living an Unusual Life. Now, this material, it was authorized by Foundry Literary Media, and honestly, the buzz around it suggests it really struck a chord.
Oh, it definitely did. And as the material makes clear, this isn't your typical self-help guide. Not at all. It seems deliberately designed to push back against a lot of the conventional wisdom we absorb about happiness, about success. It draws on such a diverse mix of stuff. You've got historical figures, philosophical ideas, rock stars, deeply personal stories. It's all woven together. People like Derek Sivers, the CD Baby founder, praised it, saying it offers real steps to figure out what matters. Kirkus Reviews called it essential reading, highlighting its very unfiltered style.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack those core ideas, often really counterintuitive ones, presented in the book, based entirely on the sources you've provided. We want to understand, well, why constantly trying to be positive or special might actually be making us miserable, and explore this different path that suggests towards maybe a more meaningful life, everything we talk about, pulled straight from the source material. Okay, let's unpack this. So right out of the gate, the book hits you with this concept that just feels backwards. Don't try. It's one of the first big things. And the source immediately points to Charles Bukowski, the poet.
Right. And the description isn't flattering, is it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Drunk, gambler, womanizer, slob. I mean, basically the opposite of who you'd picture, offering life advice. Often couldn't pay his bills. Yet on his actual tombstone, it says, don't try. So what's the source getting at with that?
Well, it's definitely not saying be lazy or give up, which is, the first place your mind goes. The material explains it more like rejecting the force. Don't force yourself to be something you're not. Don't constantly chase these external ideas of success or happiness if they aren't really you. It's kind of a call for effortless authenticity, letting things happen naturally from who you are rather than straining to look a certain way or feel a certain way. And the source brings up this really fundamental point about humans. We can actually choose our thoughts, our values. That's a huge freedom we have.
Okay. The ability to direct our own minds.
Exactly. But the source argues modern life media, ads, social comparison, it just bombards us constantly. We're always being told what to care about, what to want. And all that noise makes it incredibly hard to actually use that freedom, to decide for ourselves what's genuinely important versus what the world is just shouting at us.
So Bukowski's don't try becomes a symbol.
Yeah, kind of a crude but powerful symbol of resisting that external pressure, just letting your real self be without the constant effort.
That connects directly to what the source calls the happiness loop, doesn't it? Which feels like such a key insight. The idea that the harder you desperately try to be happy all the time,
the more anxious and insecure you actually become.
Yeah, because you feel like a failure whenever you inevitably feel, sad or stressed or just normal negative stuff.
It's the cycle where the effort itself kills the happiness.
The source uses that analogy.
Yeah.
It's a bit gross but memorable.
Yeah.
About the booger.
Yeah, the booger analogy.
If you have one, no tissue around. You don't agonize about the lack of tissue. You just go.
You just deal with it, wipe it, accept the tiny discomfort, move on.
Exactly. And the book argues the real problem isn't having discomfort or negative feelings. It's getting stuck, trying to avoid any discomfort at all.
Yeah.
Always chasing the good feeling, which just makes you anxious about not feeling good.
Precisely. And building on that, the material suggests that real freedom, like genuine liberation, doesn't come from getting more stuff or achieving more status. It comes from making that tough decision about what not to care about.
Filtering the noise.
Exactly. There's just an overwhelming flood of information, opinions, expectations, potential worries, social media, news cycles, work drama, family stuff, ads telling you you're not enough.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
Right. So the source says the strategic move is to filter, to consciously decide where not to spend your limited time, energy, and emotional bandwidth. Deciding what's unimportant not to care about is actually where you regain control. It frees you up to focus on what genuinely matches your values.
Okay, so stepping back, the core purpose of this book, according to the source material, seems to be helping you, the reader, navigate all this. It's like a guide for figuring out What stuff in life is actually worth your limited flakes?
Yeah.
What aligns with what truly matters to you?
And maybe even more critically, what stuff isn't worth it? What can you just let go of without feeling guilty or like you're missing out?
It's a kind of necessary recalibration because culture tells us to care about almost everything.
Yeah, spreads us way too thin.
Okay, so from don't try, let's shift to another idea that really pushes back against, well, a lot of modern culture. It's hinted at in that chapter title. You are not special.
Mm.
And the source connects this directly to something it calls the entitlement loop.
Yeah, this is a challenging argument the source makes. It points to this trend, especially maybe in Western cultures, of constantly telling everyone how unique and special they are. From childhood, the whole special snowflake thing parents might say, or all the marketing about celebrating your individuality.
Which sounds positive on the surface, right?
It does, but the source argues it can accidentally create this unhealthy sense of entitlement. And entitlement here isn't just like healthy self-esteem. It's more like this underlying expectation that life or other people should somehow cater to you, make you feel good, protect you from hardship, give you advantages.
Just because you exist?
Yeah.
Or because you think you're special?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
That you inherently deserve good things or good feelings without necessarily taking responsibility or, putting in the work.
And the source draws a direct link from that feeling of entitlement to adopting what it calls bad values. Not like morally evil values, but bad in the sense that they lead to, well, suffering and superficiality.
Exactly. Bad because they don't lead to genuine fulfillment, according to this framework. This is where it gets really practical and, yeah, really interesting.
Okay, let's break down these bad values as the source describes them.
All right. First one, pleasure. Now, pleasure itself isn't bad, obviously, but chasing it as your main goal in life, the source paints that as a dead end. It argues that always seeking the next hit of pleasure is fleeting. It feeds right back into that happiness loop. You need more and more just to feel okay, and you become hypersensitive to any discomfort.
So pleasure is more like a side effect of doing worthwhile things.
That's the idea. It's a result of pursuing good values, not the value itself. If all you want is pleasure, you'll avoid the hard stuff, the struggle, which is often where growth and meaning come from.
Makes sense. What's next?
Second, material success. Basing your self-worth on how much money you have or possessions or status symbols. Another trap, according to the source. It mentions studies showing that, yeah, money helps happiness up to a point, meeting basic needs, but after that, the correlation gets much weaker.
The extra money doesn't buy much extra happiness.
Right. And the source suggests that chasing more and more can actually become a kind of curse. It creates stress, anxiety, endless comparison, turns life into this joyless race.
Okay. Value number 3.
Third, always being right. Oof. This one's tough because we're kind of wired to think we are right. But the source is pretty blunt. Our brains are flawed, full of biases. We're often wrong. And the need to always be right, it's really damaging.
How so?
Well, it stops you from learning, right?
Yeah.
If you can't admit you might be wrong, you can't take in new information that challenges your view. It kills empathy because you can't truly understand other perspectives. And it's just exhausting trying to constantly defend your position.
So it's better to assume you might be wrong sometimes.
The source strongly suggests that, yeah, operating from a place of, I could be wrong, is way more productive for growth.
And the 4th, bad value.
Fourth, staying positive. This one really flies in the face of a lot of modern advice, doesn't it?
It does, the power of positive thinking and all that.
But the source argues that constant forced positivity is basically a form of avoidance. Negative emotions, sadness, anger, fear, guilt, they aren't the enemy, they're signals. Important signals telling you something's wrong, something needs attention or needs to change.
What do you want, whites?
Exactly. And just trying to suppress them or slap a smile over them doesn't fix the underlying issue. It usually makes it worse. It ties back to that entitlement to happiness, feeling like you shouldn't feel bad, so you avoid those feelings instead of dealing with the cause.
Wow. Okay, those 4 values really challenge common assumptions. The source uses a story about Dave Mustaine to illustrate this, right? Especially the comparison part.
Yes, the Dave Mustaine anecdote. It's incredibly powerful for illustrating how choosing a specific bad value, in his case, comparison can poison even massive success.
So just to recap for everyone, Mustaine, founding member of Metallica, gets kicked out early on.
Right before they exploded globally. A huge blow.
But then he forms Megadeth,
Yeah.
which becomes, hugely successful in its own right. Millions of albums, Grammys.
Objectively, a phenomenal achievement. A massive career built from scratch after that rejection.
And this is the kicker the source points out.
Yeah.
Years later, in an interview, He apparently admitted, crying, that he still felt like a failure,
Why? Because he was still comparing himself to Metallica.
even with all his own success.
Exactly. He chose a destructive metric. His mental yardstick, as the source puts it, was constantly measuring himself against the band that kicked him out instead of valuing what he had built with Megadeth.
So he created his own suffering, even amidst success.
Precisely. It perfectly shows the book's argument. The values you choose, the way you decide to measure yourself in your life, that defines the problems and the suffering you experience. If comparison is your core value, you'll likely always find a reason to feel inadequate.
Oh, yeah, that's a heavy example. Okay, let's shift gears completely. The source brings up a totally different kind of story. Lieutenant Hiru Onoda,
Ah, yes, the Japanese soldier. An almost unbelievable story.
sent to this small island in the Philippines, Lubang, late 1944, his orders were absolute. Never surrender, no matter what.
And he took that incredibly seriously.
So World War II ends in 45. The other Japanese soldiers there surrender or are killed. But Onoda and a few others, they thought the surrender leaflets were enemy tricks.
So they just vanished into the jungle.
And Onoda stayed there, fighting a one-man guerrilla war, thinking the war was still on.
For almost 30 years, eventually completely alone, until 1974.
When this young Japanese explorer, Norio Suzuki, found him. And the source draws this fascinating contrast between Onoda and Suzuki.
Right. Suzuki is described as this total free spirit. Dropped out of university, traveled the world, worked odd jobs, deliberately sought adventure, and, importantly, embraced hardship voluntarily. It was part of his chosen path.
Whereas Onoda endured decades of unbelievable suffering, isolation, hunger, danger, jungle survival.
All out of this rigid sense of duty to an order, to an emperor, tied to a war that ended 30 years earlier. His suffering was chosen based on this mandate. Suzuki's suffering was chosen as part of seeking adventure.
So what's the takeaway for us from this, according to the source? It's pretty profound.
The core argument seems to be that suffering isn't some mistake or something to be eliminated. It's just part of life, unavoidable. So the important question isn't how do I stop suffering, because the source implies that's impossible, and trying just creates new problems like that happiness loop.
Right. Trying to avoid it is the trap.
Exactly. The real question is, what am I willing to suffer for? Suffering endured for something you've chosen, for your values, whether it's a Onoda's extreme and maybe misguided duty, or Suzuki's adventure that gives life meaning, a structure, a purpose, something that just chasing pleasure or avoiding discomfort can never provide.
And the story continues when Onoda returns to Japan.
Yeah, and it's quite poignant. He comes back a hero, initially. But then he's deeply disappointed by modern Japan, the consumerism, the superficiality. It was so different from the values he'd spent 30 years suffering for.
So his decades of suffering suddenly felt
Meaningless. In this new context, he couldn't adjust, apparently moved to Brazil.
wow. So it highlights the difference between suffering for something meaningful, even if flawed, versus the suffering of meaninglessness.
Exactly. It's the meaning we attach to the suffering based on our values that matters most.
This seems connected to what the source calls the realization drip, those painful moments of understanding that kind of seep in slowly.
Yeah, it's a great phrase. It suggests that understanding difficult truths often isn't like a sudden flash of lightning. It's layered. There's the first hit, the emotional pain, the shock, but then there's the slower, maybe hardy part, the cognitive processing, making sense of it, integrating it, accepting the reality.
Onoda's return seems like a huge delayed realization drip. The meaning he lived by was just gone.
It does seem like that. And the author uses another analogy, their own experience with rock climbing, which fits well here, talking about facing reality.
Right, descending a difficult cliff face.
As the source describes it, it forces you to be absolutely present. You have to deal with the physical discomfort, the cold, the scraped hands, the muscle strain, and the fear.
You can't escape it?
No, you have to keep putting your hands and feet on the actual rock, feeling it, accepting the slow, difficult reality of getting down. It's the opposite of escaping into your head or distraction.
It's about grounding yourself in the struggle itself.
Yeah, literally putting yourself on the ground of reality, accepting the difficulty, finding a kind of awareness in the struggle, not despite it.
Which leads us to another really tough topic the source digs into. How hard it is for us to admit we might be wrong. I mean, there's a whole chapter titled, "We Are Wrong, I Am Wrong Too."
Yeah.
A pretty bold statement from the author.
It is. And the source argues we're fundamentally wired to believe we're correct. Our beliefs, our memories, our judgments, We feel they're accurate.
But questioning those beliefs, especially the core ones,
Is absolutely crucial for any real growth, according to this material. The source uses some powerful stories to show the dangers of not questioning, especially with emotionally charged belief.
the story about Mary and the repressed memory therapy is particularly chilling.
It really is a cautionary tale. So Mary gets involved in this therapy based on the idea that you can have severe trauma memories completely blocked, but they can be recovered.
And through this therapy, she becomes convinced she suffered terrible childhood abuse by her family, memories she didn't have before the therapy.
Right. And acting on these recovered memories, she confronts her family, makes these horrific accusations.
And it just destroys the family, tears them apart.
Utterly devastating. And then the crucial heartbreaking part. Years later, the source explains, research largely discredited these kinds of therapies. False memory syndrome became understood.
So people could genuinely believe these recovered memories, even if they weren't real.
Yes, vulnerable people seeking answers could inadvertently create vivid, emotionally real but false memories, sometimes influenced by the therapy process itself or their own need for an explanation for their pain.
So Mary's suffering was real.
Absolutely real. The belief, the confrontation, the family destruction, all real pain. But the source of it, the memory itself, was false.
And realizing that must have been another horrific realization drip.
Unimaginable. The source even adds a thought about the therapist, suggesting maybe they were caught in a bad value loop, maybe addicted to the drama or the feeling of being right, of having the answer.
Which highlights the danger of just adopting beliefs without critical thought, especially painful ones, and clinging to being right.
It's a stark warning about certainty.
The author also shares a more everyday example, right?
Yeah.
About their brother and his sister-in-law's fiancé.
Yeah, a much more relatable situation, but illustrating the same difficulty. The brother intensely disliked the guy his sister-in-law was marrying, was totally convinced he was bad news, the marriage a huge mistake, very vocal about it,
Certain he was right.
completely certain. And the author asks him a simple question. Why does it bother you so much?
Not accusing, just asking why the reaction was so strong.
Exactly. And the source implies this prompted the brother to maybe consider, was his certainty really just about his sister's well-being? Or was it maybe tied up in his own stuff? His need to be right, his anxieties, his idea about how things should be.
Asking, what if I am wrong?
That's the core question.
Yeah.
And it's hardest when we're emotional, when we think we know best, when our belief feels part of our identity. The source argues growth stalls without the willingness to ask it.
Okay, let's transition this into relationships more broadly. Because that's where a lot of these dynamics play out. And the source, again, pretty blunt here, says love alone just isn't enough for a healthy relationship.
Yeah, that cuts against a lot of romantic notions, doesn't it? The idea is that relationships, like people, need healthy values and, really importantly, boundaries to actually work long term.
And it critiques relationships built on that entitlement loop again.
Right. Whether it's the I'm special, you should treat me specially kind of entitlement.
Or maybe the opposite, the I'm worthless, I deserve poor treatment kind.
Exactly. Neither dynamic, the source argues, is based on reality or fosters healthy interaction. Both come from a skewed sense of self and other.
And a key part of fixing this or building healthier relationships is boundaries. The source emphasizes saying no.
Hugely important, according to this material. Saying no to things that violate your values, to disrespect, to unreasonable demands, is how you actually define your values in practice.
Without boundaries, values are just words.
Pretty much. Weak, abstract. Boundaries make them real. Without them, relationships can easily become unhealthy, resentful, codependent, because you're constantly letting your own core values be trampled. Saying no defines what you will care about by showing what you won't accept.
And the source links entitlement back to victimhood and martyrdom in relationships.
Yeah, it suggests people often fall into these roles, either feeling constantly wronged and powerless, the victim, or feeling perpetually responsible for fixing or sacrificing for the other person, the martyr.
Like peeling an onion to see those roles.
Kind of. Recognizing these patterns and the entitled or unhealthy values driving them is key to understanding the deeper dynamics.
And misplaced responsibility, blaming others for your stuff or taking on their stuff, damages connection.
Absolutely. The source argues that holding on to that victim or martyr identity, while maybe getting you some sympathy, ultimately keeps you stuck. It prevents growth and genuine equal connection.
Taking responsibility for your own part is crucial.
even if you were genuinely wronged by circumstances or people. The source argues taking responsibility for your own feelings, choices, and values now is essential for moving forward and building healthier connections. Trying to escape your problems by blaming or seeking rescue just weakens you.
What about when trust is broken? The source talks about repairing that.
It does, but very cautiously. It suggests two things are necessary, though not guaranteed to work.
Okay, what are they?
First, the person who broke the trust has to genuinely own it, acknowledge the fault, take responsibility, show real remorse, no excuses.
And second?
The person who is hurt needs to be willing to allow the possibility of rebuilding, to create space for that slow, difficult process.
And he uses that analogy, the broken plate.
Yes, the ceramic plate. You can glue it back together, maybe it might even work, but you'll always see the cracks. Trust, once broken, is fundamentally changed. It's fragile.
So the overall message on relationships seems to be about taking responsibility for your own side of the street, setting boundaries based on your values, and avoiding those entitlement traps.
That seems to be the core takeaway, yes. It's about building connections based on reality and mutual respect, not fantasies or blame.
Okay, now for perhaps the deepest theme the source tackles. It brings in Ernest Becker in his book, The Denial of Death. The argument here is that our awareness of death, it basically shapes everything.
It's a huge idea. The source explains Becker's core concept. Humans are unique because we know we're going to die. And this knowledge creates this deep underlying anxiety because the terror of death. And Becker proposed we have two selves in a way. The physical self, this body that will die, and the conceptual self, our identity, our ideas, our legacy, how we're remembered.
We're terrified of that conceptual self just disappearing, becoming nothing.
Exactly. The fear of annihilation, of meaninglessness. So to cope, Becker argued, we create immortality projects.
Immortality projects, what are those?
Things we invest ourselves in, believing they'll make our identity or influence last beyond our physical death. It could be anything, really. Creating art, scientific discovery, building a business, raising children, dedicating yourself to a religion or a cause, even just striving to be remembered well by loved ones.
These projects give us a sense of meaning, a way to feel like our lives matter beyond just biology.
That's the idea. They help us manage that existential terror by giving us a feeling of significance, of lasting impact.
And this unconscious drive explains why we strive so hard, why we want to feel special within our chosen project, like the hero myth.
Right. We want our lives to feel meaningful, heroic, like they made a difference. Because the ultimate fear underlying the fear of death is the fear that our existence was utterly meaningless.
Wow. Okay, how does the source connect this big idea back to the author's own story or the book's more practical advice? It mentions failures forward and do something.
Yeah, it brings it back down to earth. The source describes the author feeling like a total failure around 2007, 2008. Dropped out of college, couldn't find work in the recession, felt completely lost.
A low point.
Definitely. But despite feeling like a failure, lacking a clear plan, or maybe even an immortality project at that moment, he just started doing something. He started blogging as Mark Manson, maybe driven by a different value than self-expression, connection, just needing to act.
And that leads to the do something principle.
Exactly, which flips the usual script. We think we need inspiration or motivation before we act, but the source argues action often comes first. Just doing something, anything, creates momentum. It generates the inspiration.
And failure in this view isn't the end.
Not at all. It's just data, feedback, a step forward because now you know what doesn't work. The real problem is avoiding action because you're afraid to fail.
Which the source links maybe to overprotective parenting sometimes, not letting kids learn resilience through small failures.
It suggests that, yeah. And the author's own success with the blog, and eventually this book, grew directly out of that initial act of doing something, even when feeling lost and uncertain.
The source also includes those travel anecdotes, like St. Petersburg.
Right. The description of Russia, harsh weather, maybe bad food, not much superficial politeness.
But he contrasts that with what he saw as this deep directness, sincerity, valuing that uncomfortable honesty over, as he puts it, Western bullshit.
It ties back to values again. suggesting maybe valuing sincerity, even if it's uncomfortable, is more meaningful than prioritizing superficial pleasantness. It uses other examples too, like Shakespeare probably wouldn't want his plays treated like trivial entertainment, or how Romans valued virtue over fluff, highlighting how our cultural values shape what we see as meaningful or meaningless.
Like the yellow traffic tape analogy, a rule that seems important but is maybe just arbitrary.
Exactly, questioning what we automatically assume is valuable.
And the rock climbing analogy fits here too, maybe. Facing the hard reality brings a different awareness.
I think so. Confronting the difficult physical reality, the rock, the fear, your limitations, forces an engagement that's very different from escaping into pleasant distractions or entitlement.
And that idea of diminishing returns from constantly chasing new experiences.
Yeah, the source suggests that maybe chasing novel pleasures or external validation just gives you less and less meaning over time, compared to the deeper engagement that comes from struggling for something you actually value, wrestling with real problems, facing hard truths, including our own mortality, as Becker suggests.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, this deep dive into the source material from The Art of Not Giving Effect. What's the core message? It really pushes
Yeah.
back against a lot of standard advice, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It argues that real freedom, resilience, genuine meaning, they don't come from avoiding pain or trying to be happy all the time or needing to feel special. Instead, they seem to come from that harder path. Consciously choosing which difficult problems matter enough to you to take responsibility for, choosing which values are worth suffering for, and doing it all while acknowledging, that we're not here forever.
So it's a call to look inward, really question our own assumptions, our beliefs, be willing to accept we might be wrong.
Yeah, and to embrace the uncomfortable stuff, the difficult truths, and crucially, to take action, even when we're scared or unsure, knowing that failure is just part of how we move forward.
It seems like the ultimate argument, based on these sources, is that the biggest battles aren't really out there against the world, they're in here.
Against our own entitlements, our need to be right, our tendency to avoid the uncomfortable realities of life and ourselves.
Right. So here's the final thought for you, the listener, to maybe chew on based on everything we've dug into today. What difficult truth about yourself or your values or maybe your current situation are you most actively trying to avoid right now? And what is that avoidance actually costing you in terms of connection or growth or maybe just a deeper sense of meaning? What problems, what struggles are you genuinely willing to embrace and take responsibility for because they align with something you truly deeply value? What are you willing to suffer for? Thanks for letting us deep dive into this material with you today. We really hope this gives you something significant to think about.